Hello everybody, hope you're doing well, and thanks for joining us for another video. Something arguably a little bit different today. Usually I do videos where I take science concepts and debunk conspiracy theories, but today I'm going to try and address a bit of a myth that seems to have developed. We've just gone through a heatwave here in the UK, and it was even worse across much of mainland Europe. Temperatures here peaked at around 37 degrees Celsius, which is over 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Parts of France, I believe, were up into the 40s. Thankfully, at least here, things have started to cool down now. But the rise in temperatures has also seemingly led to a rise in popularity of videos about hacks of how to stay cool. And one style in particular of note for me were ones that involved combining ice with fans as a cheap way to try and cool your rooms down. Now, they do technically work, but there is an important aspect which doesn't really get talked about and could end up causing big problems for some people who try them. The idea of the hack is fairly simple in sound science. A normal fan pushes air forward, which in turn creates a low pressure zone behind it. More air is then drawn into the low pressure zone, which the fan then pushes forward, and the cycle repeats. The fan is just circulating the air around it. It's just moving the air that's in the room. It doesn't actually change the temperature of the air. It, however, feels cooler to us because our bodies are trying to shed heat. The heat energy we emit from our skin warms the air around us, but that heat then needs to move on away from that air before more heat can escape our body. But if the air is static, then it's going to take time for that heat to conduct into the neighbouring air particles. Whereas a fan just moves that air away very quickly that we've just heated and replaces it with new air for our body to heat. No different than a breeze outside. That's why it feels cooler when there's a breeze than when there's not, even though the air temperature is exactly the same. But a fan doesn't actually drop the temperature of the room. To drop the temperature of something, you need to physically remove energy from it. Cold is simply less energy, and heat energy moves from hot things to cold things. So if you pick up an ice cube in your hand, the ice isn't putting cold into your hand is warming up the ice. But in doing so, it's drawing energy from your hand, which is why it feels cold to us. So putting ice next to a fan is simply the air next to the ice is imparting some of its energy into the ice to warm the ice up, which in turn lowers the temperature of the air, and the fan is circulating away that air and replacing it with new air to impart its energy into the ice. You would get the same basic overall effect whether you were to tie the bottles directly to the fan or dot the bottles around the room and have a fan just stirring the air around in general. The basics is bottle of ice has much less energy than the air in the room. The air in the room imparts its energy into the ice, which warms the ice up and in turn cools down the air. Great. There is, however, a big factor being overlooked with these hacks, which is getting the ice in the first place. Let's say you do this hack, right? You put some ice next to a fan. A few hours later, the ice has melted because the energy from the air in the room has been imparted into the ice, and it will do so until you're just left with water that's at room temperature. And you think, that was great, I'm going to do it again. The next thing you're going to do is throw those bottles of water into the freezer. Except freezers aren't magical realms for making things cold. When you put your bottles of water into the freezer isn't directly making them cold. The bottles impart their heat energy into the surroundings, which in turn will raise the temperature inside the freezer slightly, so the freezer then has to run in order to remove the energy and cool the inside back down. Fridges and freezers run just like split air conditioner units. They have a refrigerant that circulates through the pipes inside it, basically in two halves of a system. One side is where the refrigerant is compressed, and one side is where it can expand. When something compresses, it gets hot, and when it expands, it gets cold. So in an air conditioning unit, the expanded area is generally cold. That will draw the heat energy from your room. So that energy is going into the refrigerant. The refrigerant then goes through a compressor, which compresses it, making it very hot. That's then led into condenser coils. The condenser coils in turn become very hot, so the energy from those is passed on to the surrounding air, which is usually outside. That takes the energy away from the refrigerant. The refrigerant circles back around into the expansion area, where it can be allowed to expand and cool down even further, ready to draw in heat from the air in your room again. Basically, air conditioning units are absorbing heat energy from the air in your house and moving that energy to the air outside your house, but using electricity in the process to make that happen. And freezers are absorbing the heat energy from the air inside the freezer and moving that energy to the air outside the freezer. Except typically the air outside your freezer is air that is inside your house. And that's the big thing that people should bear in mind when considering hacks like these. It's not that they can't necessarily work, but all of this is just moving energy from one place to another. Let's put this into an extreme scenario to try and highlight the issue. Let's say you live in a small open plan apartment. So you've got a living area, a kitchen and a bedroom, and it's just generally too hot. So you get a bottle of ice out the freezer and you put it next to your fan. That draws the energy from the air and puts it into the ice. After a few hours, you're left with a bottle of water, and it gets to bedtime, and typically we're more sensitive to heat when trying to sleep than while we're awake. So you think, I'll put another bottle of ice and the fan near the bed in order to cool me down overnight, and I'll put this used bottle back in the freezer so it's ready to use again tomorrow. Well, all that's happening is overnight, your ice and the fan is drawing heat from the air in your apartment, but the freezer is equally drawing all the energy from the bottle in there, which is all the energy it's been absorbing from the air in your apartment throughout the day, and the freezer's then spitting all that energy out into your apartment. Basically, your freezer is just taking the energy from one of the bottles and passing it to the other, but with the added extra heat that it generates by running the compressor even more. So technically that would actually warm up your apartment rather than cool it down. It would ultimately be no different than if you were to just leave your freezer open with a fan next to it. The inside of the freezer would be cooling down the air in one part of your apartment, whilst the back of the freezer was warming up another part. Or if you had a portable air conditioning unit but you didn't put the hose going out the window, you'd still get cold air being blown out the front of it, but you'd also then get hot air being thrown out the back, so the net temperature of the room wouldn't really change. Obviously, that apartment is an extreme case scenario where you can't or don't open the windows overnight to help vent that extra heat away, but that may well be the case. With extreme summer heat waves, overnight temperatures don't always drop by a huge amount, or the outside air temperature is around the same as the indoor temperature. I mean, technically, using sealed bags or bottles of ice can reduce the humidity in the room. Open trays of ice will add moisture into the air as it melts, which you probably don't want, but a sealed container, the moisture inside has nowhere to go, but the cold will cause any moisture in the air to cool and condense onto the outside of it. That's the wet that you get on the outside of bottles and cans when you take them out of a cold fridge or freezer. It's actually the moisture in the air condensing. So if you wipe away that moisture and dispose of it, you've reduced the amount of moisture in the air, though the actual reduction in humidity in reality is quite minimal. But I don't bring all this up to try and dump on the idea of using ice to cool things down, merely to make sure that people are aware of the actual physics behind it, because it can come back to bite you if you're not aware of it. For example, I was freezing ice bottles myself over the past few days in the heatwave. I wasn't doing it to attach them to fans, but rather just to ensure that I had plenty of cold water for myself and Rusty here to drink. So I was circulating 3 or 4 bottles like this constantly. Now, I have multiple freezers. I have a typical split fridge freezer in the kitchen, but the freezer of that is only quite small. But our house also has a garage incorporated into it, so we've put a standalone freezer in there. Now, usually in past summer months, when the house gets very warm, I can walk into the garage and it feels noticeably cooler in there because there's no windows for the sunlight to be beaming through. This past week, however, walking into the garage, it always felt noticeably a few degrees warmer than the kitchen, because the freezer was working hard and pumping that extra heat energy out of all the water straight into the garage. That was a trade-off of making the garage warmer to try and keep elsewhere cooler because we weren't really in the garage, we were elsewhere. But if I'd have done that using the freezer in the kitchen, I would have just created a loop of trying to cool me down by making the rooms that we're in hotter and wasting money on electricity in the process. I suppose what you'd ideally want for something like this to work effectively is have the freezer outside your house, like in a separate garage or an outbuilding somewhere. That would at least mean that you're moving the energy to outside of your main house. Or if you're using store-bought ice each time rather than freezing your own, though that idea opens up a whole can of worms of a climate change argument. You know, everybody goes out and buys store-bought ice to cool down their houses because the weather's too hot, which in turn means manufacturers need to produce, store, and transport more ice for people to buy to cool down their homes, which requires energy to do so, and where does the energy come from? Personally, I think the best foundation for tackling hot weather is prioritizing preventing your rooms getting hot in the first place rather than how to cool them down after they've got hot. Having blinds and curtains closed over whichever windows are seeing the sun, that will stop sunlight getting in and heating up the objects inside your house. Though whatever you've got covering the windows will likely absorb some of the light and in turn get hot themselves, so having your windows slightly open can allow that heat to not build up and actually vent away. Or, as crazy as it sounds, taping foil to the windows instead works very well because it reflects pretty much all the light away without absorbing any of it. And if you tape the foil to the outside of the window, then the heat stays all outside. If the outside air temperature is cooler than the inside of your house, but there's just no breeze moving that air around, open windows on opposing sides of your house, place a fan a few feet away from one of the windows pointing into your house, and put another fan a few feet away from the opposing windows but aiming out, and open any doors that are in between them, and this will help create a flow through your house much like the fans of a PC case. And if your goal is more just cooling you down rather than really trying to cool down the rooms in general, a cold shower or a bath works great at pulling heat away from your body. That's why everybody rushes to swimming pools in heat waves. Though if you have any personal tips for keeping the home cool in hot weather, do please share them in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this video, then do please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Though, like I said, this is usually a bit of a departure from my normal topics. I normally use science to debunk misinformation, and I suppose technically this does fall under misinformation, potentially, because I wouldn't like to see people accidentally heating up their homes whilst they're trying to cool them down because they weren't aware of the science behind it, but normally I'm more debunking conspiracies. But hopefully, we'll see you in the next video.